Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's podcast episode is really fun. It's going to be a really fun one. I have with me Dr. Jennifer Lackey, and we're going to be talking about her new book, The Epistemology of Groups. Before we jump in, I just want to give a shout out to all the Patreon patrons. You guys are awesome. A couple more of you joined this week, and I really appreciate that. For the Patreon supporters, you guys can get all the episodes early access. When I record them, I put them up. If not, you can get them. I put out 2 a week, so you can get them as they come. Another way to support the podcast is to subscribe on YouTube. And above and beyond, go to Apple Podcasts and leave me a 5-star review and a comment. A lot of you guys have been doing that lately. I really, really appreciate that. Helps the algorithms and all that crazy stuff. So without further ado, let's jump in with Dr. Lackey here on the epistemology of groups. Dr. Lackey, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So before we get into the book, I'm just kind of curious, how'd you get into philosophy generally? And then how'd you come to specialize in epistemology?
So I think I became interested in kind of deep kind of thought from a very early age. My mom went back to college when I was quite young, probably around 3 or 4. And I would wait outside her class, her college classes, waiting for her because, we just had to kind of sit there and wait, my siblings and I. And, when we would be on our way back home, she would get in the habit of telling us all about what she was learning. So we heard about Freud, and I remember her reading, kind of Thomas Hardy books, and her going through the whole stories with us. So I think from a very early age, it became quite comfortable to think really deeply about a broad range of issues. And I think I kind of took that with me when I went away to college. I was a declared psychology major, but my very first semester in college, I took a psychology class and I took a philosophy class, and immediately recognized that philosophy was my home. I declared a philosophy major shortly thereafter, and went on to go straight to graduate school after my undergrad. I took an epistemology class my junior year, and again, it was almost kind of like an immediate connection with that material. So all of this happened quite early on when I was an undergrad.
Okay. Well, that's so cool. Well, so as you mentioned in the book, not a lot of attention has been given to the epistemology of groups and lies, group lies, things like that. So how'd you ever even get started thinking about the epistemology of groups?
Well, I think one thing that's really interesting that I think I was only able to see when I took a step back from the book project was how much group lies were really motivating that project. I think in many respects, I kind of start off the book project talking about group lies, and I end the book project talking about group lies. So I think one of the things that has always been of interest to me is making epistemology relevant. I think there's a lot of epistemology that's really quite abstract, and many people who are not philosophically trained would not only have difficulty following what is going on in some of the debates, but also seeing why they matter. And I've always been drawn to the area of epistemology called social epistemology. So my dissertation was on testimony. I've always been really, and I'm writing right now a book on the questions at the intersection of epistemology and the criminal legal system. So I've always been really drawn to epistemology's applied social relevance. And I think I got really interested in the topic by, really wanting to have a framework for understanding how we can hold groups responsible. So the project really got off the ground by thinking about all of the ways in which institutions, governments, universities, corporations, pharmaceutical companies, how they can interact with individuals and bring about a lot of different kinds of benefits, but also harms, and how we can hold groups both morally culpable and also praiseworthy for their actions. And we really do need an epistemological framework for that. We need to be able to understand when groups lied to us, when they made an assertion, when they knew something, when they believed something. And when I started thinking through how to hold groups responsible for their actions, I was really shocked by how little philosophical literature there was exploring these issues and providing a framework for being able to assess groups and their actions in that sort of way.
Yeah, and you made a really interesting point on another podcast, New Books in Philosophy, and you said, we've been lied to by groups probably more than individuals. I thought this was so
Hmm.
interesting. At first, it took me aback, but then you said, if someone lies to you a lot, you're probably not keeping them around. But
Right,
these corporations are here every day. We're going to BP for gas all the time, and
right.
they lie to you all the time. And so I
All
thought
the
that was
time.
such a fantastic, just short little argument there, that we are being lied to by groups often. And so, like you said, this isn't an abstract ivory tower type thing. This is something we need to think about if we want to hold them accountable and hopefully stop being lied to as often.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, throw in some of your favorite, kind of corporations or, and you'll see, kind of just a litany of articles and lawsuits that have come up, kind of Philip Morris and BP is one. And, there's just a lot of cases. I mean, Pfizer has done a lot of, good recently, right? But if you
Mm.
Google Pfizer, there's also a lot of multi-million-dollar payouts for very harmful behavior on
Yeah.
the part of Pfizer. So I think that we really do need to have a framework for being able to hold groups responsible for this kind of behavior.
Yeah. That was what was so interesting. You do really emphasize the practical application here. I thought that was really interesting because there was no talk of like ideal groups or anything like that. It was all actual groups, and you gave tons and tons of examples. I think that was really, I like the speculative, abstract stuff just as
Mhm.
much as anyone, maybe more. But I thought it was really helpful to have practical applications for these. Another interesting thing about what you're doing with group epistemology is in holding corporations responsible. You're taking the epistemology route, and I've seen more kind of debate and argument around holding groups responsible from philosophy of mind, and it gets into really tricky, weird stuff about extended mind thesis and
Mm,
do they have a group mind or a hive mind or something, and it gets really your incredulity goes up real quick.
mhm.
Likewise, maybe in action uh, action theory and free will type stuff. So I thought it was really interesting that you took you're an epistemologist, but the epistemology route seems more believable. It seems like we can buy it a little bit better without getting into kind of the crazy philosophical speculation. So another thing I just really appreciated about your book. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really wanted to come from an angle where this is a topic that philosophers can make progress on, and as I and there are kind of some abstract arguments in the book.
Sure.
But I also wanted to be very, very clear that this is something that is happening in our daily lives all the time. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of litigation involving groups, institutions, corporations, kind of companies, universities, and also that when you look at how we adjudicate those cases, we invariably invoke very epistemologically loaded concepts.
Mm.
And so we're already doing this. And so what we need to do is ensure that we have a proper framework for grounding what we're already doing
Yeah.
in many kind of socially and practically relevant aspects of our lives.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I had Kasim Kassam on recently talk about one of his old books. I have it right here, the possibility of knowledge. He talks about how possible questions. So that's just right there in my mind. But
Mhm.
when I was reading your book, I thought this seems like you're answering a how possible question. How is it possible for groups to lie? And then you discount and refute other accounts that aren't yours because they can't really account for group lies. Does that sound right? Is that a fair assessment of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I said that kind of I start with group lies is because it's really group lies that convinced me personally
Mm.
that groups have beliefs in a substantive sense. I
Okay.
mean, when we talk about groups believing something or knowing something, I think that there's a temptation to think of that talk as being kind of metaphorical
Yeah.
or loose talk, or really it's just talk that's ultimately reducible to talk of individual states. And one of the things that convinced me that groups have beliefs in a robust sense is my kind of reflecting on what it means to say that a group lied to us. And we
Mm.
really can't make sense. I mean, one of the essential components that even people, kind of even philosophers who deeply disagree about the nature of lying agree upon, is that lying is essentially connected with belief.
Yeah.
If I lie regarding the question whether P, either I believe that not P, or at a minimum, I fail to believe that P.
Yeah.
At a minimum, right?
Yeah.
And so we can't make sense out of a group lying to us without us understanding what it is for a group to have a belief in a robust sense. So I really became convinced that groups have beliefs by just having kind of a first premise: groups lie.
Mm-hmm.
We can't make sense out of groups lying without groups having beliefs. Therefore, groups have beliefs. So I came to the whole project by a simple little argument that starts with a premise that groups lie.
Yeah.
And so, given that premise, it became really important to me to also provide a framework for understanding what it is for a group to lie to us, given that at the time that I wrote the book, there were no existing accounts of understanding group lies.
Yeah. And that brings up another point about bullshit in the Frankfurt sense, right? And so for those who don't believe me, there's a book on this. It's a tiny little book. You might think that Frankfurt is bullshitting with this tiny little book, but it's actually a really good book. And I like that you brought up that account. You said that your theory has to account for group lies and group bullshit. And group bullshit is they don't really care about the truth or falsity of their assertions. It's just they're whatever is expedient for them. Is that a good assessment of bullshit in Frankfurt's case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Frankfurt kind of very famously points out that in many respects, bullshit might be even more pernicious than
Mhm.
lying, because both the truth teller and the liar have to care about the truth. The truth teller to kind of hit the target, the liar to avoid the target, right?
Yeah.
But the bullshitter just doesn't care about the target at all. And there's a sense in which the disregard for the truth is in a way kind of deeper or perhaps more pernicious for the bullshitter than it is for the liar. And so I think that one of the things I show in my book is that existing accounts of group belief cannot accommodate group lies, and neither can they accommodate group bullshit, both of which I think are extraordinarily important for us to be able to understand group accountability.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to take you into the book, but one last thing. Do you think we need motivation for premise one that groups lie, or do you think everyone just we all kind of know that we've been lied to? I wonder if an eliminatist might say that's just a metaphorical sense. When we say groups lie, we still need to pick out the actual individuals who have lied to us, or do you think it's just no? We all know that groups lie to us. We've all been lied to before.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, I really do take that premise as something that we all accept in the book. I don't spend a tremendous amount of time arguing for it. It really is, in many respects, a starting point for me. I mean, I think that, if I were hired by my employer and they had, kind of the people that I was working with in HR, or, kind of like the dean and, kind of various other people had made certain promises to me
Mhm.
at the time of trying to get me to sign my contract. And then it turned out that they knowingly had no intention of satisfying those promises. I mean, sure, I could pick out like this person in HR and this associate dean and maybe this assistant dean. But I think there's a much more kind of compelling case for saying, like, my university lied to me, right?
Mhm.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
like my employer. And a lot of these people are just cogs in a very big machine. Maybe some of them weren't even aware of what they were doing, kind of because a lot of institutional lies really do kind of come, they're very, very top down. And so a lot of kind of participants in the lie or in the deception are really just that, sort of cogs in a machine, right? They're just kind of busy kind of doing their work, without fully understanding the role that they're playing in this kind of much more systemic or institutional level deception. And so I think kind of trying to accommodate lies or broader forms of deception, by just looking to individuals, misses something deeply important when we think about the systemic level of some of these kinds of deception. I mean, I think that there are, I mean, one of the things that I find really fascinating in the when you look at kind of the way that a lot of these sorts of cases are handled in the law, at least in the United States, is that you find these two different ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So you find some cases where a corporation will say, look, this was just a couple of bad apples. Volkswagen took this approach recently, right? It was
Mhm.
like 3 rogue engineers. You know what I mean? 3. That's it. There were
Right.
3.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's what accounted for all this massive scale of deception at Volkswagen.
And
And
they
many
put something in the exhaust pipe or something where it said that
That's right.
you're going to pass emissions test, but it actually didn't. And like
Right.
no chance that this was 3 rogue bad apples, right?
That's right, right. But that was Volkswagen's stance, right? This was just 3. We're firing those 3. Volkswagen itself, like we're in the clear now that we've gotten rid of those 3 rogue engineers. But then you see in some cases the opposite approach, where they will say, a corporation or a company will say, we're not going to really disclose the names of any of the particular people who were involved in this. This is really just a company level or a corporate level
Mhm.
kind of problem. So give us a fine, and our employees will go on doing exactly what they're doing. And that also seems problematic, right? Because sometimes you have these very high level people in these, corporations or these just kind of other kinds of institutions who are then able to move from place to place and continue this sort of broad level deception that inflicts tremendous harm on individuals. And so one of the things that I hope to really encourage in thinking through these issues is that, sometimes individuals are responsible, sometimes collectives are responsible, and we need to be able to distribute responsibility across both
Yeah.
individuals and groups.
Yeah, I think the second one you used maybe National Semiconductor, if
That's
that's
right.
the name.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought that was that's such an interesting case because it's like this united front kind of thing. And it
Mhm.
sounds great probably if you work there, hey, our company's got
Right.
our back. But also
Right.
if you did something criminal, you wouldn't punish a company the same way you would punish an individual. It wouldn't make
Right.
sense. You don't
No,
send a
you
whole
can't.
company to jail.
That's right. That's
But
right.
and so
Exactly.
it's actually really problematic on both of the extremes. Um, do you is are those good analogies for inflation and deflation? Is that a good time to jump in there? In my mind, I thought of Volkswagen as deflation and semiconductor as inflation,
I mean,
inflationary.
that's really interesting. I mean, in a broad sense, I mean, the deflationary inflationary distinction usually, at least the way that I use it in the book, applies to like phenomena like group belief, group knowledge, group
Yeah.
justification. And what we see with the National Semiconductor and the Volkswagen contrast is more this framework used at the level of responsibility,
Ah.
which is my starting point, right? That's the motivation for the project.
Yeah.
But I think you're exactly right that applying the inflationary deflationary framework to the idea of responsibility does really end up, kind of with the National Semiconductor and the Volkswagen contrast. Um, but the inflationary deflationary distinction I tend to use with respect to very specific group phenomena like a group belief state, right?
Mm.
And what is that? And the inflationary theorist is going to say group belief is something that's over and above the beliefs of individual members. It's kind of groups have kind of these states on their own,
Mhm.
and the deflationary theorist is going to say no, group belief just really is um, should be understood in terms of the individual, believing states of group members.
Yeah.
And on the deflationary side, that I think it's maybe a stretch to call eliminativist deflationary theorists, but there are people who are just like, look, it's just metaphorical talk to
Right.
use the idea of group states. And then there's more like a reductionist view, which says it's not just metaphorical; it's just that group states are ultimately reducible to individual states.
And a reductionist would be in a deflationist, right?
That's
That
right.
makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
I think of I think I kind of got into philosophy through philosophy of mind, so I always try to use some of those hooks to hang stuff on. And inflationary to me seems like kind of emergence, and it's like there's
Mhm.
this new property that emerged out from all the group members, and
Mm.
none of the group members have it equally, but it's this new emergent phenomena. And then deflationary is like supervention, and it's like, okay, you can't have the group thought without like the strict supervening on the individual members, so they all have to have it. Does that sound right? Does that sound fair?
I mean, so with respect to the emergence, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, I think that when you look at a lot of the work in the epistemology of groups, a lot of it does not get deeply into the metaphysics of
Right.
how to understand these states. So, I mean, inflationary views in epistemology tend to be justified by virtue of what's called divergence arguments.
Okay.
And really, what these arguments purport to show is just kind of intuitive cases where we would say that there's a group level phenomenon, but no individual member plausibly instantiates this phenomenon. So I discuss a lot of cases like that in the book.
Mhm.
I mean,
The
you
parents are
know,
helpful, I think, was
yeah,
really helpful for
yeah.
me.
Right. So these are kind of split the difference cases, right? Like where like one parent says, I don't think that our child should stay out till midnight until they're 18. The other parent says, I think it should be 16. So as a united front, they accept 17. Right. And so neither actually believes that 17 is the appropriate age. I mean, in fact, they would say no individually, but as kind of as parents, as a collective, as a couple, they would say it's 17.
Mm.
And so what we're invited to conclude about these sorts of cases is that you have a group level belief state, but there's no individual who instantiates it. So you have to be an inflationary theorist, right?
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you think that it makes sense to say that there can be a group belief or group knowledge where no individual member possesses it, you have to be an inflationary theorist. So that's how we get to inflationism. Very few epistemologists then go on to tell us the mechanics. I think they really are thinking we'll save that for the
Okay.
metaphysicians or the philosophers of mind.
Sure.
What we're really here to show you is that from an epistemological point of view, it makes sense to say that there is a group level state where there's no individual state. And just metaphysically, that necessitates that the group is over and above then the individuals, because there's no reductive or supervenience base
Yeah.
upon which the higher level, the group level phenomenon supervenes or kind of reduces to.
Yeah. What would a deflationist say about the parent case?
The
Yeah.
deflationary theorist is just going to deny that that's group belief. I mean,
Okay.
so the deflationary theorist, or that's group knowledge or anything like that. I mean, the parent case is a little bit tricky because we're not really talking about like what's the knowledge, the knowing state, but there are other cases like that. So
Mhm.
let's just restrict our comments here to belief. The deflationary, I mean, so I'm not myself a full-blown deflationary theorist.
Right.
I try to kind of walk this kind of line because I think that groups are agents, epistemic agents in particular, in their own right. But I do think that there has to be an anchoring base. So I'm not a full-blown inflation with respect to certain phenomena, not assertion and lies, which I have something else to say about. So what I would say in this kind of case is that the group actually doesn't believe that it's 17. They've accepted this proposition. In the knowledge case, I would say that with respect to some of the cases that they don't know that P, they're in a position to know that P, or they kind of have available to them evidence that P. So I would say different things in different cases,
Mhm.
but in most of these cases, I just don't in any way feel the pull of attributing the belief in the case.
Mm.
I mean, in much the same way, like, so I think the parent case is similar to like the juror case, right?
Yeah.
Where I asked to imagine a case where all of the jurors accept a particular proposition on the basis of the admissible evidence. So the admissible evidence points to not guilty. But they all, on the basis of inadmissible evidence, personally believe in guilt, right? So
Mm.
what we're invited to conclude in that case is that the jury as a collective believes that the defendant is not guilty, but each individual member believes that he is guilty. And I'm not pulled towards the conclusion of saying that the jury believes that the innocent is that the defendant is not guilty. I'm inclined to describe that as they delivered the verdict not
Yeah.
guilty. They judged not guilty. they accept the proposition not guilty. So I think there's a lot of very familiar language to us
Hmm.
for explaining what's happening in those cases that doesn't invoke group belief.
Yeah. Yeah. I probably should have brought this up a little bit earlier, but Dr. Lackey, what do we mean by group? I know because I read your book, but it can, for those just tuning in here, who counts as in the group or out of the group? You did a great job with talking about, I forgot the exact specifics, but like the left-handed students at Northwestern. And it's like
Mhm.
they're not really intentionally joining this group, which would be different to like a chess club maybe or something. Can you just help us out real quick before we jump in even deeper?
So I think there's a lot of groups, and I actually try to be fairly inclusive. I mean,
Hmm.
so one of the things I do think that we all, even those, so some people are going to really be talking about, I think, very highly structured, organized groups. So imagine if you're coming to the collective epistemology literature and you think that what is sort of essential or the most important about a group is that they engage in collective deliberation, then you're going to probably be more interested in structured
Yeah.
kinds of groups. You're probably, because, kind of think about, I mean, I might kind of do a survey on campus of all kind of left-handed Northwestern students and kind of aggregate that data and then say left-handed Northwestern students do not think that there are enough left-handed desks in the classroom. So I'm talking about a group, left-handed Northwestern students,
Yeah.
but left-handed Northwestern students don't engage in any sort of collective deliberation, right? I mean, they're not, unless I put them all in a room and say,
Right.
hey, talk amongst yourselves about, the situation here. So that kind of group might be quite different from like the Supreme Court, which engages in collective deliberation all the time, or a jury who goes to the kind of who kind of goes into the jury room to deliberate about a case. Um, so I think there's like a lot of different kinds of cases. There are also corporations
Mhm.
which are structured in some ways, but also kind of like there's a lot of like different members. And so there's no, I mean, you can have a corporation that has like a branch in Tokyo and one in Chicago and one in
Yeah.
Paris. And so, also a group of that sort is not going to be kind of sitting around a conference table talking. So in general, I kind of, I just kind of try to lay my cards on the table and say, I'm interested in groups such that we can hold them responsible for their behavior.
Yeah.
So I kind of come at this. A lot of those I do think that there is something interestingly different about groups that have the capacity to engage in collective deliberation and those that do not.
Hmm.
But more importantly, what I'm motivated by in this project are the kinds of groups that we can hold responsible. And so that's a really loose notion, right?
Yeah.
Right? Because like think about the people who were involved in the attack on the Capitol, right?
Hmm.
I mean, in some respects, can we hold that group responsible in any sort of meaningful way, or do we have to look at particular individuals? When we think about, and I bring that up as an example because sometimes groups end up forming even on the spot, right? You might think of
Right.
a group of protesters who all came from very different parts of life, and like there's no like kind of structure, they're not engaging in any sort of collective deliberation, but 3 hours in, they might actually be the sort of group that we would want to hold responsible because they've had conversations, they've made some decisions about how they're going to proceed,
Yeah.
um, and so on. So I think just the most important thing for me is that we look at groups um, through this lens of being able to hold them responsible.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, and I like the broad tent thing too because the more specific you get, the less applications I think it can have. And so, in having a broad swath, you could hold a corporation responsible, or the group of janitors within the corporation who plot to kill the CEO or something, because that's a
Right.
different group, but it's still in the group. But not everyone in the whole corporation is responsible for that. Yeah, it seems like you would need a case by case to specify the actual the group involved, so that the innocent are not being held responsible or culpable for the crimes of the guilty.
Right.
That's really
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're well, actually, I wanted to go over a couple of your arguments. Again, I appreciate you going through all this because I know when you write a book, it's like you're so deep into the literature, and then time goes by, and then someone asks you on a podcast and says, "Hey, can you just reprisonate all this stuff for?" So I really appreciate you doing another deep dive into this work again. I thought maybe we could go over, if it's on the top of your mind here, some reasons, like contra inflationary approach and then contra deflationary. You have this manipulation of evidence problem for the inflationary approach. Do you still have that up there? Can you lay that out for us?
Yeah. So one of the things that's really interesting about inflationary theorists is that they all of the views really gravitate towards this idea of joint acceptance.
Mhm.
And you see this model with respect to belief. You see this with respect to justified belief, which is kind of interesting, but it's because they talk about jointly accepting reasons.
Mhm.
But this kind of this voluntary act that group members engage in really provides the basis for a lot of these inflationary views. So to take a step back, what is group belief? What does it mean
Yeah.
to say that a group believes that P? For many, not all, but for many inflationary theorists, in fact, I would almost say most, although there's the whole judgment aggregation side of things.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of leaving that to one side for now. But for many inflationary theorists, what that amounts to is the operative members, and by operative members I mean the members who have like some sort of decision making authority with respect to the question at issue.
Yeah.
The operative members jointly accept the proposition that P. And so like let's go back to the parents. What happens in such a case is that like neither believes that P. That's not really what matters, but they together as a couple say, okay, look, we together as this child's parents are going to jointly accept that 17 is the age at which she can stay out till midnight. And so, and the jurors are doing something very similar. And so this leads to the positive view that a lot of inflationary theorists espouse. And that's that group belief just really does amount to the joint acceptance of a proposition with some kind of complications, but none of them, that really is the heart of the view.
Okay. Yeah.
Is this joint acceptance. And I raised some problems for this view, which I think broadly I put under the heading of the manipulation, that there's this problematic manipulation of evidence that is allowed on such a view. And what this amounts to is that you can, so then we also see this with respect to the justification side of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the justification side, you can jointly accept reasons, and those reasons then become the reasons that the group has for believing that P. So then justification can come apart too,
Yeah.
because you can jointly accept reasons for believing something. And that explains the admissible evidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're jointly accepting a subset of reasons for deliberation quad jurors, but you don't accept that kind of subset of you have a broader evidential basis as individuals that
Yeah.
includes the inadmissible evidence. And so what ends up happening is, I think on these views, you can fail to jointly accept evidence that you ought to accept, and you can illegitimately accept evidence that you shouldn't accept. And then you end up with this really problematic result that groups can be justified, or at least have reasons available to them that they shouldn't have available to them from an epistemic point
Yeah.
of view, and fail to have evidence or reasons available to them that they clearly should. So let's just take Philip Morris, very classic example here. On this view, Philip Morris doesn't have reason to believe that smoking is dangerous or poses a threat to people's health unless they jointly accept those reasons. Right? Individual members might, but Philip Morris doesn't. And so obviously, why couldn't Philip Morris just say, "Hey, we're just not going to kind of jointly accept that as good evidence, right? We're going to
Yeah.
go look at these these rogue publications that say that it is reliable. That's what we're going to jointly accept as our reasons or our evidence." And so you end up with Philip Morris not having a reason to believe that smoking is dangerous,
And
or
then
kind of,
not being held accountable. How do you hold them accountable if they don't believe that they were telling a lie?
or they don't have the reasons available to them.
Right. Right.
And so I think that this is, I mean, to my mind, like a very, very, very serious problem for inflationary theorists that have an epistemological dimension to it. Because once you start putting things like evidence available to people and reasons for belief, once you start making that subject to the absolute will of individual members, well, then you just open up the door for practical
Hmm.
and financial and all sorts of totally epistemically irrelevant factors to be dictating when and why people accept reasons. And then they end up having these epistemological assessments of being justified or reasonable that wildly diverge from what I think they ought to be held, kind of how they ought to be assessed.
Yeah. I wonder, so like Philip Morris, if they could stack the deck with operative members that are ignorant, uh, who don't have the evidence, like, and then it seems like there might be a Sorites kind of paradox in how many of the operative members have to have that belief. And someone could stack the deck if they said, hey, we don't want to tell a group lie, but I also don't want to acknowledge that this stuff's bad for you. So I'm going to bring in a bunch of people on the board who are operative members, but they have no clue about any of this stuff. Maybe they're
Mhm.
cognitively limited, or you burn for a different part of the world, or whatever it is, such that they can have like plausible deniability because they didn't reach the threshold to have, I don't know, group assent or something like that.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, so good. I mean, I think that that's the question you're raising now is really kind of a problem, I think, more for deflationary theories. Although
Okay.
I think that it actually impacts everyone.
Yeah.
So I guess I just want to say, like, I think that trying to stack the decks by who your members are is something that every single view is going to have an issue with.
Okay.
Because let's think about like inflationary views.
Hmm.
Stacking the decks about who's going to jointly accept what can determine what people end up believing. And
Hmm.
for the deflationary theorists, what individual members believe anchors what the group believes. So you can
Yeah.
stack the decks by bringing on people who believe that smoking is in fact safe.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think this is something that cuts across all views in the epistemology of groups. But I don't think that should be that surprising. I mean, like, I think that of course, like, group makeup is going to have an impact on what groups believe.
Yeah.
So I myself don't think that that's a really serious problem. Bringing on board a whole bunch of operative members, that actually is I think a little bit trickier than we might think it is. I mean, like, it'd be really weird to bring on board people who know nothing about Philip Morris and make them like the CEO. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So
Yeah.
so I think that it's a little bit tricky, but I think that in general your point is exactly right, but I think it affects everyone. I don't think anyone has a real advantage here, because anytime we bring on board people with different attitudes, it's going to change it will has the potential to change the believing states of of the corresponding groups.
That's good. That's good. You just showed your practical philosophical acumen there, which is really good, because I wanted to go hypothetical, but in reality, no one is bringing in a ignorant operative to be the CEO. That makes total sense. That's a great point. All right. So how about, so we beat up on the inflationary folks a little bit. How about the deflationary folks? You have this problem, this group justification paradox.
Yeah, I'm going to give like a really streamlined version of this
Sure.
problem because it gets kind of it's kind of it has like a fair bit of detail in the book. Um, so the streamlined version of the problem is that the deflationary theories, and I work with a view that was recently defended by Alvin Goldman, which I think is really intuitive and like a really helpful starting place for thinking about deflationism. And that's that there's a kind of very intuitive way of thinking about group justification. And that's that if you increase the individual members who justifiably hold a belief,
Mhm.
then you thereby increase the group's level of justification. This is very intuitive, right?
Mm.
And I think that it comes from this idea, I think Goldman calls it transmission, that individual justifiedness is transmitted to the group level. So it just kind of like, you can just imagine it sort of flowing over to the group. So you just keep throwing in, I mean, kind of picking up on the earlier part of our conversation where we were talking about adding members to the group, right?
Yeah.
Who kind of hold. So if you just keep adding members to your group that hold a belief with justification, then the group level of justification is just going to continue to go up. And that's, I think, a really intuitive starting point. And in many respects, that is to some extent like the heart of a simple deflationary theorist view. Is that like group justifiedness really just does boil down to individual justifiedness. But one of the things that I kind of discuss at some length in my book is how this picture, I think, is much more complicated.
Yeah.
And it's much more complicated because when you bring in when you continue to add individual members, you're also adding individual, like, kind of reasons for why they hold that initial belief. So
Mhm.
I believe that P because of Q. You believe that P because of R. Someone else believes that P because of T, right? I mean, and we can all believe that P, but for very different reasons. I might believe it on the basis of testimony. You might believe it because you saw it. Someone else might believe it because they, kind of, inferred it. So like we all can believe that P, and we can all believe that P with like a robust level of justification, but we might have very different reasons for believing that P. And once you start noticing this point, it becomes very easy to massively complicate the picture.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I do, right? And I massively complicate the picture by arguing that once you see that people can believe that P for different reasons, those reasons themselves can conflict.
Yeah.
And so I can believe that P because of Q, and you can believe that P because of like not Q, right? Or something like that.
Right. Right.
And those two reasons can add a very deep level of incoherence to our overall belief framework as a group.
Yeah.
And so what this shows is that that the complication of those reasons when they conflict can either undermine the basis for justification or add what's called defeaters to the
Yeah.
justification, the justificatory framework. And defeaters defeat the justification for belief. So what I show is that like you can increase the level of justification, you can add more individuals, and the level of overall justification in the group can go down.
Yeah. And that's why it's a paradox. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I thought
And
that's so interesting because that was your problem with Gold. I know you're following Goldman, but Goldman's kind of leaves room for what you just talked about, for this paradox to arise, that evidence isn't just all good. And
Mhm.
and you give this condition as we get into your account, that it has to be coherent. And when
Right.
you have coherence, then you can have increased justification in the group. But if you just let it wild west, then who knows?
That's exactly right. And I think that, one of the things that I really like about kind of thinking deeply about Goldman's view is that it is just so intuitive to start
Mhm.
with. It's so intuitive to think like, of course, more justification is better. More is better, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think I do through complicating that picture, showing that more is not always epistemologically better, more evidence is oftentimes worse off, right? And
Yeah.
it's very obvious. I don't think that this is like a super deep point once we kind of pause and reflect on it. Of course, sometimes more evidence is worse, right?
Mhm.
Um, but I think that it's really magnified when you're talking about groups, because you're talking about the possibility of so many different individuals believing things for so many different reasons.
Right. Right. Okay. So then, what you do, you kind of throw a wrench into both systems, and then you say yours is kind of in the middle. I wonder if you would see it leaning more deflationary, but you also complicate things because you're more inflationary when it comes to assertion and lies, and then more deflationary when it comes to beliefs. Is that right?
So I'm Yes. So what I would say is I'm a full blown inflationary theorist about group lies and group assertions. And I think I have a principled distinction for when I'm a full blown inflationary theorist and when I'm not.
Mhm.
And I'm a full blown inflationary theorist when you can grant another agent the authority to constitute other things on your behalf through
Yeah.
their own actions. So when someone can kind of fully be a proxy agent for you, and by proxy agent, I really mean your doing it constitutes like my doing it, right? That's what it means for you to be a proxy agent. You're doing something on my behalf. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry about
No.
that. You're doing something on my behalf
Yeah.
is just to for me to do it.
Right.
And so when you can, so I think that I can grant someone the authority to assert on my behalf.
Mhm.
And so given that, I think that that gives rise to these situations in which someone you have cases where um, a group asserts that P, but no individual member asserts that P or has even asserted. And so, in that sense, it really is the group that asserts that P, right? So, you
Right.
can imagine like the chair of my department
Mhm.
asserting on our behalf, right? That we want to hire candidate X for the job. Now, you might just say, well, this is just straightforward. Like the group's assertion, kind of is just reducible to the chair's assertion, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
But I actually don't think in these sorts of cases the chair is asserting, because I don't think that any of the norms governing assertion govern the chair's, kind of what the chair is doing in that case. So
Yeah.
think about some of the norms governing assertion: sincerity, assert that P if and only if you know that P, assert that P if and only if you believe that P, assert that. All of these norms that are out there, none of those apply to the chair. He shouldn't assert that P if and only if he believes that P. What he should do is report the view of the group.
Right. Right. Right.
Assert that P if and only if you know that P. We don't care whether he knows that P. We care whether he is representing the department accurately. And so I
Mhm.
actually think in those sorts of cases, he is his assertion, kind of what he's doing is not an individual assertion. The chair is not asserting as an individual.
Yeah.
It is a group assertion. And so in that case, I'm an inflationary theorist, like a fairly robust inflationary theorist. When it comes to things like belief, knowledge, and justification, my view is a little bit more complicated. You asked whether I lean more towards deflationary or inflationary, and I would like to say neither. I would
Yeah.
like to say that while there's a very clear deflationary component in that, I do anchor my accounts of group belief and group justified belief and group knowledge in the individual states of group members.
Mhm.
Um, I think that the evidential relations that arise only at the level of the group make groups epistemic agents in their own right.
Ah.
And so I think that those evidential relations are absolutely key to us assessing groups.
Mhm.
It's all of those evidential relations that massively complicated the deflationary theorist picture. And so those evidential relations that arise at the group level are really, really, really epistemically um, central to my project. And
Yeah.
that's why I call my view an epistemic agent account, because there's a distinctive kind of epistemic agency that arises at that group level through all of these evidential relations.
Yeah. In your group epistemic agent account, you say it's not strictly summative and it's not strictly non-summative.
Right,
And for those listening, summative is everyone has to believe it's the sum of all of it.
right.
And so I wrote it down here, group agent, it's based off your group agent account, and then you move from there to your group epistemological or uh, epistemological agent account. Um, a group C or a group G believes that P, if and only if one, there is significant percentage of G's operative members who believe that P, and two, are such that adding together the bases of their beliefs, that P yields a belief set that is not substantively incoherent. And so that's that really important criteria that you developed from Goldman, that so you don't fall into the group justification paradox. Two, it has to be coherent. But with one, the criteria in one, a significant percentage of G's operative members who believe that P. Is that case by case? How do we determine the significant percentage of the operative members?
Yeah, I try to be really I try to not be committal on that because
Mhm.
you're going to have some groups who are like the parents, right?
Yeah.
So who are the operative members? Like both, right? I mean, you're not going to have that it doesn't make sense to talk about um only one member of that group being operative or only one
Right.
member of that group. Like both have to. So a significant percentage of operative members with the parents is both.
Yeah.
um with a with other groups, I mean, like when we're talking about corporations with like tens of thousands of members, or like it's just really, I think you're gonna have a very different kind of, so I wouldn't want to say like 76%, because I mean, like, first of all, that just is, it's just really arbitrary and
Right.
surely false. um but also, I think that it's just going to really vary on the basis of the structure of the group, the policies and procedures of the group, how we determine who the operative members are. So, what I really am trying to just kind of gesture towards in that condition is that operative members need to believe it. And this is not an inflationary view. You
Yeah.
do need some of the key members who believe it, and how many of those is really going to be determined by features that are specific to the groups themselves.
Okay. I just because it's been so practical. This is one of the first epistemology books I've read where I've thought about the practical application. I thought maybe Dr. Lackey needs to be in the courtroom helping them figure some of this stuff out. I thought it was so cool to think about. But when I don't know who would determine that when it comes to a group, that'd be really really tough. I guess the lawyers would have to make a case for saying, hey, 51% of the operative members believes that, and therefore you should be held responsible and or responsible for a lie. Of course, whatever the action is, they need to be held responsible. But now we're going to penalize you even worse for lying about it because we've determined that a operative number, a certain number of operative members believe that it
Mhm,
was a lie.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, it's like I think that there are going to be clear cases over here and
Yeah.
clear cases over here, and as with most things in life, the
Mm.
ones that fall here are going to have to be adjudicated.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that um, you know, I, I didn't want to impose, kind of like I said, an artificial and surely misleading
Right.
um, kind of criterion for this gray space that's just going to actually need to be, like I said, just adjudicated.
Yeah. Well, that's so helpful, and I'm glad you didn't do that too because yeah, I think it's a broader framework which is needs to be taken up and can be taken more seriously and actually applied in courtrooms, which is really would be really cool to see people using this in trial and talking about
Mhm,
groups because, like we said in the beginning, groups lie to us a lot and they should be held responsible and accountable
mhm,
for that. Um, Dr. Lecky, as we finish up here, um, I wanted to see if we could pull some threads together from other disciplines,
mhm,
subdisciplines in philosophy.
mhm.
Are you familiar with which came first, epistemology of groups or like philosophy of action, group action type stuff? Did one of those give rise to the other? Because I kind of know more about the action. I had a guy talk about group action and stuff like that, but yours was the first that I came across with group knowledge.
Well, definitely, like, group intentionality, which is directly connected up with group action, has a very robust literature
Okay.
and is very well developed. And there's a lot of different, there's like shared agency and
Yeah.
collective agency and shared intention and collective, I mean, and all of that. That's a very, very, very robust and well worked out body of literature, in contrast to collective epistemology, which is much um, newer and less developed.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, and a question about that too. So, does this fit rightly in collective epistemology, or and is there a sharp distinction between social epistemology and this? I know you talked about those in the book. I wasn't able to get into that section as much as I wanted to.
Mhm.
Do you find a hard and fast line between the two?
So I think that social epistemology is just a very, very, very broad label. I
Okay.
mean, I do social epistemology, which I think includes a lot of different sub areas. So I'm currently working in legal epistemology, which I think is an area of social epistemology. I do work in applied epistemology, which looks at very specific issues like the epistemology of false confessions, for
Yeah.
instance, which might be applied epistemology. And collective epistemology, the epistemology of collective entities, I think is just a sub area of social epistemology. So I think social epistemology includes a lot,
Mhm.
and collective epistemology is just a more specific kind of area.
Okay. And so your book, would you say, so since social is really broad, would you categorize this as a work in collective epistemology?
Yes, it's a work in collective epistemology, and it's also a work in social
Yeah.
epistemology.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Okay.
yeah.
Well, that's so cool. It was so fascinating, so fun to talk with you. The book covers so much more. We could have done, just a billion of these. But thanks so much for all of your time. You do so much. I wonder if you might say a word about what you do with prisons.
Yeah, so I founded a prison education program at Northwestern. It's the only degree granting program in Illinois that provides a comprehensive liberal arts education. So many years ago, I went into prisons and just started teaching one-off philosophy classes that were not credit granting and didn't add up to, kind of be degrees. And now we're offering about 36 courses a year in prisons in Illinois through Northwestern. So we're offering a broad range of courses. I think just in the last couple of quarters, we've offered courses in television writing and drawing and thermodynamics and history and psychology. And so our students are getting, as robust of a Northwestern education as our on-campus students receive. Except when we have like kind of constraints that arise because of the students being incarcerated.
Yeah.
But we launched the full program launched in the fall of 2018, and I'm now the director of that
That's
program.
awesome. Yeah. So I just wanted to bring that up to further emphasize the practical application of philosophy to real world problems, to life, to educating people. I think that's awesome. I love what you do, and I'd love to have you back on, talk about some more of your work. I think it's really fascinating. Is there a place, Dr. Lackey, where people can find you if they wanted to see more of your stuff?
Yeah, I have a website. So if you just went and found me at Northwestern University in the philosophy department, you could find access to my research and some of my work in prisons, all on my website.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put a link in the description here so people can find that more easily.
Perfect.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Lackey. This has been really, really fun. That's going to have to do it for now, folks. But stay tuned for some more coming up. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.